How much of the target language is used in your classroom by both you and your students? I'm talking about truly communicative language. Today's episode is a leveling up episode where I coach Helen, who is a German teacher in Wisconsin. Using the target language more regularly and authentically is the area where she wants to level up her teaching. So let's start the conversation. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for listening to a podcast about language teaching. You know, it's one of those things that makes you an incredible educator, so thank you very much. And speaking of incredible educators that really want to be introspective about their teaching, today I'm going to be speaking with Helen, who is a German teacher in Wisconsin. And this is a leveling up coaching episode where Helen wants to look at her teaching, wants to have a conversation about it. And we're going to focus specifically on the target language in the classroom and staying in the target language. But that's going to be what we figure out together as we're talking, what that's going to look like. But you may be thinking, maybe in your own classroom that, maybe you could be doing things a little differently, and could you be having more target language? And if not, so hopefully as we're having this conversation, you can see some places in there where this could actually be applicable to your own teaching. So I'm going to bring Helen into the conversation. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be part of this.
You had mentioned to me a little bit that you're a German teacher and you've been teaching for about 5 years. And can you just give us a little bit of a context of what your teaching looks like in terms of number of classes and students, just so we can contextualize that?
Absolutely. So I am the only German teacher in my district. I teach German 1 through 5. That 5th level is a dual credit class through UW Oshkosh in Wisconsin. I typically have 2 sections of German 1. One will be at the middle school and the other at the high school. And the rest of my levels, it'll fluctuate 1 or 2 sections depending on how big the previous year was. Once we get up to German 5, it's usually 1 section because there's only about 15 or so students. So definitely as we get up to 4 and 5, the numbers taper off. But those 1 and 2, sometimes I get lucky and I can have up to 2 sections of both.
We had talked earlier about the idea of having that many preps and how do you deal with that and how do you plan for that. So maybe we'll have a coaching episode later in the year where we focus specifically on that, because I know that is definitely a situation that a lot of teachers find themselves in. But today we're going to talk about staying in the target language in the classroom. Now, it's interesting, Helen, that you have all the different levels. And so this question of staying in the target language, when you initially reached out and said, this is the topic that I would like to focus on, is it because of any particular level, or is this sort of something you want to address amongst all of the levels?
It's a little bit amongst all the levels. I've noticed over the past 2 years that, funnily enough, I tend to be able to stay more in the target language in the lower levels versus the higher levels. And I think a lot of that is due to the simplicity, quote unquote, of the topics in the lower levels. And it's easier to use simple words. It's easier to use comprehensible input versus when we get to German 4 and 5 and we're talking about interviews and cover letters and standards of living and all that sort of thing, where the topic is much more complicated, specifically at those higher levels, but it's also in general.
For using our time most effectively during this conversation, would you like to focus on those 3, 4, or 5 levels more specifically, since that seems to be a little more of where the challenge area is?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, so with that lens, and you can choose one of your classes. It's better to just have one specific class, even if you have multiple
Hmm.
sections. Like, be looking at one, even a group of
Hmm.
3 students consistently for all of these questions, because it helps to keep it sort of in the same realm. When you are in that class, and which one are you thinking of? Are you thinking of a German 3, 4, or 5 class? Which one are we going to use?
I'm thinking of my German 4, but mostly because of the students that will be in German 4 this coming year.
Right.
So
Okay.
thinking of certain students in that group.
Yes, because we're having this conversation before the start of the school year,
Yes.
because this is going to come out later in the year. But just, so it's in terms of who are those students going to be.
Hmm.
So it's always a little interesting to have these conversations over the summer, because it's sort of, well, I don't actually have students in class this week, but you have that idea of those
Hmm.
students that will be going into German 4, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So you're kind of looking at them as their German 3 students, or,
Yep.
you can maybe superimpose what they'll look like as
Hmm.
their German 4 selves. And so when you're in the class, you're in a particular class with these students. And what does that moment look like, sound like, feel like when you think, wow, I really would like to have more target language happening here? Talk about what that situation feels like.
So often it comes up in situations where we get off topic and we start talking about what they're doing over the weekend or what they did yesterday or upcoming sports. I have a lot of students who are in track and field, and so in the spring we often talk about how their sports seasons are going. It's once we get to the end of those conversations and I'm like, wow, I just really worked on this relationship I have with a student, but it was entirely in English. And there
Hmm.
were parts where it could have been at least partially in German or could have been more in the target language. And it's hard to balance that building relationship with staying in the target language, especially with these
Hmm.
students where now I've had them for multiple years in a row and we've got a good rapport, we've got that good banter back and forth. And so
Hmm.
now it's just switching that over into the target language.
And so in those situations where you find yourself thinking, "Oh wow, this isn't going as planned or as I'd hoped, because we're not doing it in the target language." So what have you tried to do sort of to mitigate in those circumstances when that happens?
A lot of what I do is more internally reflective, and I tell myself, okay, tomorrow I'm going to stay entirely in the target language. Tomorrow I'll do this. Next class we'll do this. Or I'll try and set up an activity that I know that I've introduced the target language before and I know it was successful, or pick an activity that that class has done before so that when I re explain it in the target language, it's easier for them and it's easier for me because I know there won't be those miscommunications.
Hmm.
But a lot of it is reflecting and then changing practices for the next class. There's not
Hmm.
a ton that I have been able to do or that I have done so far in the moment to mitigate.
So when you have those introspective moments where you say, "Tomorrow I will do this," are you able to follow through and do that?
Sometimes, you know, there's some days where I'll finish a class and I'm like, heck yeah, that was so good. I did that entirely in the target language. It was fantastic. And I'm always super excited and proud of those days. But then there's the next class will come and it's like, I definitely should have done more in the target language. Why can I do it with some days and some days not? And definitely those some days not outweigh the days that I do. And that's where
Hmm.
it's struggle
Hmm.
is.
So those days when you see that it is happening,
Hmm.
where it's not the struggle bus days where you're thinking, oh, that could have happened in German and we did it in English. But when the
Hmm.
days when it does happen, what are you doing? What is happening in the classroom that is allowing for that to happen, that's not happening on the other days?
A lot of those days tend to be more group work days in the sense that here's your question and now I want you to talk about it with your table group or write about it for a couple minutes and then we'll discuss it as a group where the kids and myself, the students and myself, have time to collect our thoughts on the topic and think about what we want to say and how we want to say it before we go and share it out with each other.
I like to call this the opportunity to put on our rose-colored glasses, where every class feels like you just described, right? Every
Hmm.
class is not the, oh, I wish I had, day. You don't have those situations. So, what would it look like if I walked into your classroom and you're feeling like you are exactly where you should be in terms of using target language? What would I see if I walked in?
Ideally, you would see myself walking around the classroom and listening in on student discussions, which will also be entirely in the target language,
Hmm.
fingers crossed. And then when we wrap up our table chat and students come out to share, they'll have good, insightful thoughts in German. And then I'll be able to extend on those thoughts or ask follow up questions, obviously in the target language. And then we continue this dialogue about whatever our topic is. Just a lot of back and forth, a lot of co constructing language and meaning about whatever our topic is.
Does that seem achievable for you, or does that seem like I don't know if I could ever get there?
I think in levels 4 and 5, that would definitely be achievable. I also struggle with my students staying in the target language or even starting to use the target language. A lot of them revert back to English. And so that's another struggle point is not only
Hmm.
myself, but also my students. But at those upper levels, I definitely think it's attainable.
I'm going to give you some suggestions to think about to get there. But in terms of your own journey and your own reflection, what is something that you could do more consistently or more of to make sure that you and your students are using the target language in your classroom? Because you've talked about having those good days when it's happened, and you've actually mentioned 4 or 5 things that you do already. I want to see if you're going to recognize what those things are that you could be doing in your classroom to have more target language.
I definitely think I could continue giving students time to write and collect their thoughts. That's one of the things that I remember learning in undergrad, and it's just I've carried it with me when students can write down their thoughts first. And maybe it's something where I mentally script out what I'll say for certain activities or introducing certain topics so that there's already language set up for me and having time to discuss where it's a little bit more unstructured and then
Mhm.
then I can bring it back together with the class and go from there.
So, what are those moments or those classes where you feel like, wow, we did a lot in English today?
Mhm.
What do you think contributes to that happening?
It often tends to be at topics where students get stuck and they don't always understand for the sake of time because we only have so many minutes in every hour instead of trying to circumlocute whatever the topic is or try again or take more time. I'm like, you know what, we're just gonna, instead of trying to go about this in German, I'll just give it to you in English for the sake of time so that we
Hmm.
can get to the homework, so that we can get to the next activity that we're doing.
So it's the treadmill of content and curriculum and things
Yeah.
sometimes don't allow for what is good teaching, right? That we
Mm-hmm.
sort of that we fall
Yes.
trapped to that. And and I totally understand that we are often teaching within a system or a school or a department that has a dictated curriculum. And
Mm-hmm.
you do have to stay up with it, particularly if there are common assessments and things like that. And so those are things where I could say, oh, well, we're just going to cut down the curriculum and you're not going to do as much. And if you have no control over that, that's not a really good suggestion. Right. So I want to honor the fact that a lot of times we are not in a position of being able to immediately change that. A good place to be is having sort of the data of the curriculum being too heavy in terms of the number of topics and the time given. And as you're revising curriculum within departments moving forward, to look at that, for the next year or a sequence so that you can scale back on the topics and things like that. So to keep those things in mind rather
Mm-hmm.
than just we do these units every year, we do this grammar every year, but I do understand that we're not always in a position to be able to change those things, but we can be a part of the conversation
Yes.
and have the data to show that because if you had more time, you wouldn't have to
Mm-hmm.
revert to English, and that in
Yeah.
itself, and I'm sure other teachers in your department might feel the same way. So just to
Mm-hmm.
keep in mind with that's more of an umbrella overarching thing.
Yes.
If we look more specifically at some suggestions, what's interesting is this happens very often is that we don't often have time as teachers to sit and reflect on our own teaching and have a conversation about it. And when we do, you end up actually answering your own questions. So
Mm-hmm.
as I was listening to you and you were telling me about, oh, it's a question of time and having to cover curriculum. It's a question of, I want them to write and reflect and then speak about it. But if there's no time, we can't do that. Or is it a question of the topic being too challenging, which means I need to do more pre-reading work or
Mm-hmm.
pre-listening work so that they have the background to be able to engage with it, right? So I was actually hearing you say a lot of those things in there, but then there's the barriers that come up. And that is really good data and talking points for you as
Mm-hmm.
you are engaging in conversations with whoever's involved with your curriculum, and just say, I don't need more support from you. I just need more time. I need more time on tasks so that we can handle this well. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the things you were saying in there do come down to that question of time. But I do want to look specifically at some things to also be trying. And in terms of teacher coaching and mentoring, I like to look at 5 possible areas that, here's the challenge. It can fall into one of these areas. So, one of them could be a question of the classroom management. And I'm not talking about behavior management in terms of the way the class is structured and things like that. There is a behavior component that could come in that's usually very individual to students. And then there's the delivery of the lesson itself, how students are engaging, and then there's the lesson planning that goes into it. In listening to what you're saying there, I actually think that the place to focus is on the management piece, with a couple of examples about that. And that is going to influence what some of the actual lessons are, and then how students are engaging and how you're planning those lessons. So you'll see how they kind of all go into them each with each other. The first thing, and this is a management piece, maybe even a student behavior thing, is in terms of your own modeling of using the target language. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see, like, in your reaction, you're like, everyone can't see it. They're listening to us, but you're nodding your head. You're like, yes, yes, good modeling there. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you stay in the target language, it models to the students to stay in the target language. And the less we're in the target language, the more students think it's okay to not be in the target language. One thing I will point out, you had mentioned earlier about the, like, you have your days where you can do it, and then there are
Mm-hmm.
those topics where you can't. Then you'll have the days where it's like, oh, no German happened today. Or, and you'll have those days where, oh, I did so much German, or in the lower levels it was easier, so you have
Mm-hmm.
those situations. So one thing to keep in mind, if it's not something regularly happening, is that it takes stamina, and we have to respect that. Staying in the target language takes stamina. The least effective way for a teacher to do it that I've seen, and I've seen a lot of teachers in the classroom, the least effective way is to go between target language and common language of the students, to go back and
Mm-hmm.
forth, back and forth. It's more effective if you can have routines, at least at the beginning. I mean, you want to move towards the most amount of target language possible in the classroom. If you can get to 100%, amazing. But on the road to get there, start with 30%, 40%. Because not only is that, if it's something new to you, if it's not something you have the stamina of always doing, and it's not, physical stamina, it's mental stamina to, like, make the language comprehensible and all that, doing it for 20 minutes can be taxing, not only on you as the teacher, but on the students listening to it. So we have to remember they also need the stamina. And if you're translating, they are not going to focus on understanding the target language if they know the translation's coming, right? So that's also the stamina piece in there. In terms of looking at it from a management perspective, is in your classroom, have those routines that always happen in German.
Mm-hmm.
They always happen. So, say it's the first 10 to 15 minutes of class, whatever those routines are, they always happen just in the target language. So if you're doing something like a calendar talk, or you were talking about they have games and things that are
Mm-hmm.
going on in their lives, like those conversations do entirely in the target language. It's going to be common vocabulary that's coming up that they're using. So in terms of the stamina of staying in the target language will be a little easier. And then as the year goes on, increase that amount of time. So it's increasing your own stamina and as well as the students in terms of listening and what their output is. But this idea of we kind of did 20% today and tomorrow I'm going to go in and it's going to be 100% target language. That's just not effective,
Mm-hmm.
because it takes a lot of practice, and I keep using the word stamina because it truly does require that to do that. So in terms of looking at what those routines in your classroom that are regular enough that you and students are comfortable staying in the target language. And then once you're comfortable with those, then to focus on the other areas. But trying to do everything at once is where it gets to be a little more challenging. So, what are you hearing in there about routines?
This past school year, I did introduce calendar talk, and so
Mm-hmm.
that went really well. And every day we'd go over what was yesterday, what's today, what's tomorrow, what's the weather, and even the German one students, they were catching on, and that went really well. I also do a weekend chat at the beginning of every week. And that's one of the places where I think German should be so easy to speak in at that point, because it's all about, okay, what did I do over the weekend? It's my interests, it's my hobbies, my free time activities. Those are things we literally learn in German 1. But that's where I hear a lot of English going on. And I want to build that routine of this being in German. And maybe that's giving kids chat maps so that they can have something to reference, and
Mm-hmm.
giving them more sentence structure, sentence frames that they can pull from. But I think that starting with the weekend chat, making that entirely in German, would be
Mm-hmm.
a very feasible starting place.
Again, you answered your own question because my next suggestion was going to be having those scaffolds for students to stay in the target language, whether it is word walls or
Mm-hmm.
chat mats, anything like that, right? See, again, when you have the opportunity to just sit down and talk about your teaching, you when you have the time to do it, you have the answers to these things. I love it. I love having these conversations because this is usually how it goes, right? It's like,
Oh, yeah.
of course, that you should be using chat mats. It's just a
Yeah.
question of I just need the time to stop and think and remember that and then make
Mm-hmm.
them. So
Yes.
having those routine moments along with
Mm-hmm.
those elements like chat mats or word walls, those scaffolds for students, those resources so that they can stay in the target language. They're also going to be helpful for you to stay in the target language because you can
Mm-hmm.
use them as circumlocution tools and help students in using those as well. So yeah, those the scaffolding, and you're also modeling using the
Mm-hmm.
target language for them there as well. So that's in terms of the management piece. But then when we are looking at the actual student engagement and the lesson planning and the lesson delivery, I think that we have to remember that students, they will engage, and this is not an absolute every time, but generally speaking, students are going to engage in the target language on topics that are of interest to them. And so
Mm-hmm.
we have to make sure that even if they have to read a book or a story or something and it's directly tied to the curriculum, finding ways where they can personalize it, where they have a similar experience, or they have seen a movie that is something like that, or they've read a book that's similar, where you can find those personal connections. Because you had even mentioned earlier when they're in the small groups and they're speaking, that you're hearing it happen there. And that usually happens because they're talking about things that they want to be talking about. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of the lesson planning, it's the using, as Stephen Krashen says, compelling input. Because we talk
Mm-hmm.
so much about comprehensible input, where it's comprehensible to students. That's great. But they actually have to care about it. Like they have to care about or be really driven to know how the story ends. They want to
Yes.
know what happened when he got home. Doing things like don't end the story today. The story's going to end tomorrow. Then you can start like, what do you think's going to happen? That's where they're like in the target language. How do you think the story's going to end? Who's going to end up at the house? Who knocked on the door? Those intriguing things for students. And that's more of a lesson planning, but I actually think of that more as lesson pacing. You were talking a lot about the pacing earlier in terms of the time that's available for things, but you need the time to pace it out looking at it that way. The last piece that I would say suggestion wise is in terms of the consistency with students and your own consistency with the target language, set the expectation that they are using the target language. That means that sometimes we want to be like that teacher all the kids really like and everything, and sometimes it's sort of, I'm only going to answer that if it's in the target language. That was a great interpretation of what we just read. That was a great idea of what we just read. They say it in English, and if we honor that and say, oh great, wonderful, and then move on, then that just sets the idea that they can talk about it not using the target language.
Yeah.
And the more things they have, like chat mats to talk about literature, a lot of times with chat mats, we think of it as very concrete vocabulary, but it can be with literary devices. And to talk about using similes and metaphors and having really advanced chat mats, for your level 4s and 5s, and having a debate on something or explaining their opinions on something, but having chat mats for that as well. Don't reinvent the wheel with chat mats, because you can seriously go on to ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT to make all of these chat mats for you, and you will have them in less than a minute.
I never thought about using ChatGPT
Yes,
for that. I love that
absolutely.
idea.
Absolutely. Just go on, put the prompt in, and say, I need a chat mat for German 5, and it is intermediate, mid to intermediate high actual proficiency level. And I want it to have sentence starters for argumentative language and trying to convince somebody of my idea. And it will give you all of it with the translations. And you can even say, give it to me, please, in very formal language. So then it can be used in writing. Or I would also like it in informal language where students are just discussing in the classroom. But ChatGPT can create all of those things for you, or any AI tool you might be using.
That's such a good idea. I literally never thought of using
Yeah.
ChatGPT for that. That's so smart.
The other thing when you're doing chat mats is always leave spaces for adding on to them. Like, don't have them like exhaustive, they have everything possible. Do like maybe 10 things on them, but then students are going to need language that you hadn't thought of to put on there, or ChatGPT didn't think of to put on there. And then you can have them add that on so that it's a little more personalized with language that way as well. Also, once you have those, then you can also use those in the classroom. So, if we kind of take a step back now and look at sort of some of these suggestions and our plan moving forward. So, if we look at your first couple of weeks of the school year, the perfect time to sort of start fresh. You're going to be starting in a couple of weeks. Definitely start with that clear expectation to students. Like, we're going to use the target language. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to actually live it and say, you're not going to allow students that are a level 4, level 5 to respond in English, and you accept it, promote it, value it, and then move on. And it's great. But also say there's an opportunity here where we should be doing this in the target language. And if they have those chat mats, then they can use those as sort of their, I will say their fallback, but their support, their resource. So I would say for your first couple of weeks of the school year, in terms of setting up your classroom, like really think about the chat mats for different levels. And also, you might even come up with different ones for different units. The language is going to be different that students need. If this were 3 years ago, I would say, oh, this is a huge project. But with AI tools, it's really not. And once you have your template that you could just cut and paste into, that would be pretty amazing there. As you're moving forward through the school year, just to find those opportunities to make sure that the input and the topics are, yes, comprehensible, but also interesting and compelling and captivating for students.
Yes.
And what I've found with that is the best thing to do is ask them.
Mm-hmm.
Ask them. You know what the sports games are and the concerts and everything coming up. Okay, then that's what we're going to talk about. What other things are happening that you can sort of find resources on with all of that. If you have like one or two of the things that we talked about, you're like, okay, I can sink my teeth into this and try this
Mm-hmm.
out this year. What might those be?
The biggest thing will be what you said right at the end is not allowing the German 4 and German 5 students to, quote, get away with answering in English. If
Mm-hmm.
if the expectation is that I should be staying in German, then my expectation for them should be the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is only my third year at my current school, and so I think the first 2 years, a lot of what I was doing was building those relationships because they all really liked the previous teacher, and I was like, please like me. And so I was, I guess, a little bit looser with that German English, and now that I'm more established at the school, I think I feel more confident and more comfortable saying, okay, nope, auf Deutsch, bitte, stay in the target language. And then also the chat maps. I already had an idea in my head for like one specific thing where I was like, I'm going to give the kids a chat map. But now that you mentioned make one for every unit, make one for every level, and especially with Chat GPT, now I'm thinking like, oh, I can use these last couple weeks of summer and just like start typing through Chat GPT, see what comes up, what I like. And I think that would really elevate the language use in class for myself and the students.
And particularly when using ChatGPT, keep creating them in the same conversation thread. Like, don't start a new thread every time, because once you define by saying, oh, could you actually do two more? Or could you make the sentences shorter? The sentence frames are too long. And once it answers all your questions and gives you what you want, keep going on that thread and say, using that same template, create a chat mat on this topic. So keep it going in that same conversation because it'll know what you want without having to go through that every time.
Smart.
This was an absolute pleasure talking with you. We'll definitely reach out and we'll talk about planning multiple years and preps. I've done that for a number of years myself, so I would love to talk shop on that. But thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much for your time and your insights, because you offered a lot of your own solutions as we went through this conversation. But thank you so much for being here, Helen.
Absolutely, it was my pleasure. Thank you, Joshua.
What insights or inspiration did you take away from that coaching session? If you want to dive deeper into your own teaching practice, consider joining me for a Leveling Up episode. Just click the link in the show notes and we can set it up. You'll also see a link while you're there for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.